Welcome back to Base Bible. Our main show week after week is providing fun scholarly commentary on the Revised Common Lectionary. But for this video, we are doing our second book review. In this case, we are covering Warren Carter's new commentary on the Gospel of Mark from the Wisdom Commentary series. And it is fitting that this commentary is coming from a feminist perspective because in what feels like a previous life, I did my Masters of Theology at the University of Edinburgh on a post-colonial feminist interpretation of the Book of Revelation. So it's something that I particularly know quite a lot about. But let's first talk about exactly what a commentary is. A commentary is essentially a book that takes one part of the Bible and goes through that one part of the Bible systematically, verse by verse, explaining its meaning, putting it within a wider frame of context, and giving a lot of useful, reliable historical context in order to understand its meaning. So it's really helpful for those that have not encountered the Bible before or are unfamiliar with the Bible, but want to dig into each of its parts a little bit easier and to wrap their heads around, what's essentially ancient history. As you know, here at Base Bible, we actually love to use scholarship. And the main reason for that is acknowledging the simple truth that there are people who have read the Bible before us that know a lot more about it than we do. Okay, they are scholars. They've done a lot of hard work understanding these texts, and they've provided this genre known as commentaries to help us, whether as lay people or academics or aspiring clergy like myself, to understand the text better. But commentaries are also dependent upon what is called a hermeneutic. A hermeneutic is a fancy academic term meaning your frame of interpretation, how you choose to interpret something, the lenses through which you read something. And there are a variety of lenses that people use when commenting upon Scripture. These include canonical approaches, so that is interpreting a part of the Bible by other parts of the Bible. These include, the patristic interpretation, so how have church fathers interpreted this? There's what's called reception history, which is, maybe how this text has been used in art. Or there's what we do here at Base Bible, which is interpret the Bible within the context of the lectionary itself. So here is what we get into what exactly is feminist interpretation, which this commentary comes into. Well, scholars might quibble with what I'll say here, and they might have a problem maybe with my oversimplification, but this is what you have to do on YouTube, okay, folks? So a feminist interpretation essentially does three things. It looks at gendered power dynamics, okay? It looks at gendered power dynamics, and it looks at these in three particular ways. It looks at these behind the text, that is in historical context in which the text is produced. It looks at them within the text, that is in the rhetoric of the text itself. And then most especially and most importantly, it looks at these gender power dynamics in front of the text. That is how contemporary readers will read the text and appropriate it or use it to configure or understand or react to present day gendered power dynamics. Okay, so that is a very simplified definition of what feminist interpretation is all about. And it's important to say this, that the point of feminist enterprise is not to serve as an apologetic for women. It is rather in part to recover women's history and literary roles in all their complexity and to learn from that recovery. So that is the aim of feminist scholarship, because as you may have figured out, my relationship with feminist politics is a complicated one because I'm a terrible heterosexual white man, right? Okay, so shame. So my relationship with feminist politics is a complicated one. But in terms of being an academic and having a feminist interpretation of the biblical text, I know from personal experience and personal study that it does often yield valuable insight. So with that, let's dive into this volume from Warren Carter. Warren Carter is a widely accomplished New Testament scholar and Baptist minister. He currently teaches at Phillips Theological Seminary, and much of his previous work has focused on the Roman imperial context of the Gospels. The Wisdom Commentary series is the first series to ever offer detailed feminist interpretation of every book of the Bible. The series is done from a wide array of scholars to cover every aspect of the Bible, not just female characters or just sex and gender, but really all the different power dynamics that might be of concern to feminist interpreters, or be of concern to the well-being of women, the marginalized, or even the planet. Barbara E. Reed is the series' general editor. She is a Dominican sister and a widely accomplished New Testament studies professor. So what does Warren Carter in this particular volume on the Gospel of Mark offer as he self-describes as a male feminist? What exactly does he bring to the text? Well, he brings first a vast wealth of knowledge of Roman imperialism to bear upon interpretation of the Gospel of Mark. This is what he's done in his previous work, and it also occurs here in this volume. But one of the crucial things that Warren Carter does in this book, and this is really the unique contribution that Warren Carter brings, is looking at the masculinities present in the Gospel of Mark. For Carter points out that it's natural for feminist interpretation to focus on the female characters of the Gospels, even the neglected ones, the unnamed ones, and that this is a very natural focus for feminist interpretation to begin with. But Warren Carter has noted that this focus risks leaving men's power and presence as natural or normal or essential, even divinely sanctioned, rather than recognizing and evaluating masculinity as constructed, performed, and sometimes dangerous. Critical attention to constructions of masculinities in the gospel, including that of Jesus and his male followers, is a necessity. So this is the unique thing that Warren Carter brings in this volume. Now, while we cannot possibly summarize a mammoth commentary of over 500 pages, what we can do is maybe offer some unique contributions that Warren Carter brings in this volume that I think are particularly noteworthy. So the first of these is looking at how Christ's masculinity in the gospel is constructed both as a competition against Roman emperors, as well as a rejection of the power of Roman emperors. So here's an example. When Jesus, walks on the sea in the Gospel of Mark, or he calms the storm, this is clearly in competition with a lot of the claims of ancient rulers, including especially Roman emperors, who claimed to be masters of sea and land. Right? So we might think of calming the storm or walking on the sea as a sign of Jesus' divinity. But what we might lose is that this claim to divinity is actually a claim of contest against other Roman emperors' claim to divinity and to be the masters of sea and land. Right? So this is the male competition that's going on here. But what we might also miss is that Jesus, in calling his disciples to follow his own example of being a servant, right, of being essentially slaves and household servants, is actually calling them to what in the ancient world would have been considered women's work. Okay, so there's this competition of male power and dominance, as well as the rejection of that very competition. Secondly, in this commentary, Warren Carter, I think very interestingly, points out that Christ's masculinity in the Gospels has an emotional life all of its own. Jesus is quite emotive in this Gospel. So for instance, when Warren Carter looks at Jesus's anger in the gospel. He points out that in the ancient world, often anger was conceived of as a feminine quality because it meant being out of control, right? You were out of self-control, you were emoting something, and it was viewed as very feminine. It wasn't very manly to have bursts of anger. However, in other ancient philosophies like Aristotle's, sometimes anger might be appropriate depending upon the context in which it's expressed. So Jesus' anger might have been viewed as effeminate, or it might have been viewed as righteous outrage, depending on what you thought of was manly or not. Okay? And then third and finally, we could see that while the Gospels often call female readers to emulate and identify with male characters, essentially, make the correct confession like Peter, even if your name is Sarah, for females to identify with males. That what happens also in the Gospel of Mark frequently is that male readers might also have to identify with female characters. Here's what Warren Carter says. Male readers who consider themselves loyal to Jesus and beneficiaries of his actions must identify with a bleeding woman in the active and determined exercise of her faith. This cross-gendered reading strategy for male readers is, of course, what women readers are required to do constantly through the androcentric gospel. In this scene, though, in a rare experience, cross-gendered reading is required of male readings. Altogether, then, this is Carter's unique contribution to the Gospel of Study of Mark, is looking at these various aspects of masculinity. So how Jesus' masculinity is both a contest to Roman emperors, but also a subversion of their power game. 2, Jesus' emotional life might have been perceived differently depending on what you conceived of as manly. And then 3rd, this dynamic in the text that will often require not only female readers to identify with male characters, but for male characters to identify with female characters. Overall, this has been a very interesting commentary to read. So with that, let's now get into our PB&J. Now we are going to do our sandwiching technique, which means to give one slice of bread of praise, some criticism in the middle, and then another slice of bread of praise, just so that it's all digestible. Warren Carter is a clear writer. He doesn't use a lot of academic jargon unless he needs to, and he often has charming features in his writing, like asking whether the author of the Gospel of Mark took a selfie. Okay? Warren Carter is also really good at pointing out a lot of biblical allusions. So wherever the Gospel of Mark quotes another Bible passage or makes an allusion to it, Warren Carter is really good at explaining where all these are coming from, as well as giving possible echoes of various Roman propaganda and Roman images that are occurring in the Gospel of Mark. So these are really valuable things. Finally, Warren Carter is also really good at showing you that he's read a lot of the scholarship, previous feminist scholarship on these areas, spending a lot of time giving various points of view on passages, such as when he gives you 12 pages talking about the mysterious ending attached to the Gospel of Mark in chapter 16. So Warren Carter shows you that he's got a whole panorama of viewpoints on a particular passage. Now let's get into some criticisms. Mainly there's 2. The first is that Carter repeats himself a lot. He repeats a lot of the same information that he's given you previously in the book, and he repeats a lot of the same theological opinions that he has with different passages. As a result, this commentary, I think, is far too long. I think you could have easily reduced it a lot if you did not repeat as much of the material. You could have, it's over 500 pages. I think it could have easily been brought down to 400 pages and thus made at least a little bit more readable. But secondly, and this is a much more substantial critique that I have here, Warren Carter often points out from looking at other scholarships, such as Benny Liu or others, that there might be sexual innuendos present in some of the language of the Gospel of Mark, and Warren Carter brings out what these sexual innuendos might be, but he doesn't really explain as to why it would be helpful to possibly see these sexual innuendos in interpreting the Gospel. So an example of this is the parable of the sower. Carter points out that there was a large ancient line of interpretation that takes a look at how, farmers in the ancient world were looked at as masculine figures who are putting their seed into the feminine ground that would then birth children out of the ground, because the earth ground is like a woman, right? So, is there a procreative metaphor going on here in the parable of the sower? So, but what happens is Carter gives you that information that perhaps there's some sexual innuendo going on here, but then doesn't really explain as to why it might be helpful to read the parable of the sower in that way. And this frequently happens throughout this commentary, of him just leaving you suggestions that there are sexual innuendos, but then doesn't really bring out what significance, if any, there might be in possibly seeing a sexual innuendo present in another part of the gospel. Okay, so those are my two big substantial critiques, is that it's far too long, and some of the interpretation is kind of just left hanging. Now, for our last slice of bread of praise, the best praise that I could ever give to any book or any commentary is what it has taught me new. What new information it's given me, what new gems of wisdom have I learned from it that I'll keep in my back pocket. Okay, so this commentary had at least a dozen or so for me, and I'll leave you with one crucial one. I think he does a really interesting job of looking at chapter 16 in the Gospel of Mark, in which we read that the women encounter these two young men that tell them that Jesus has been risen, and then the Gospel of Mark ends with that the women leave and say nothing to anyone. Now, we might normally read this as, and the women were scared, and then they told absolutely no one after again, and it makes the women look not too great. It kind of makes them look like Peter denying Jesus in the courtyard. It kind of looks like they are failing to tell the male disciples what exactly is going on here. But Warren Carter points out, along with a lot of other feminist scholarship, that this phrase at the end, that they said nothing to anyone, has been used elsewhere in the Gospel of Mark to refer to characters that Jesus instructs to not tell anyone else, not as a reference to tell no one else ever anywhere, but tell no one else except the people that I have told you to tell. Okay, so when the two young men say to the women, you are to go tell the male disciples, and especially Peter, that Jesus is risen, and then when we read that the women said nothing to anyone, it's not that the women didn't fulfill that commission, it's they did, and they said nothing to anyone else. Okay, I think this is actually a really good reading point about this gospel, and it's a much more charitable and substantial reading of the women disciples here at the end, that they fulfilled their commission by telling the male disciples what has happened with Jesus, and that they said nothing to anyone else. Okay, so I think that's a really good, helpful, valuable read. Overall, Carter's commentary is well above sufficient, and it has a lot of really good information. Well, thanks for watching. That is us here for this book review. Thank you to Liturgical Press, who was the publisher of this commentary, for sending me a complimentary copy. They did not require that I give them a positive review. They did not ask me to become a sponsor or anything like that, but thank you so much to Liturgical Press for sending a complimentary volume. Please remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and consider becoming a Patreon subscriber, especially if you would like to see more book reviews, or if you have a book in mind that you would like me to review. Please check out all the different tiers of our Patreon subscription to find out how you can do that. Thanks again. We'll see you here next time. Blessings to you.